Part 9 is fixed as a silent emotional afterglow, not a plot resolution. The entire architecture of parts 1 to 8 will now be engineered to converge toward one understated reversal embodied in a tiny gesture rather than a spoken payoff. The final scene will not celebrate victory, explain meaning, or close thematic loops overtly. Instead, it will center on Jonathan after the public climax is over, when the room has emptied and power has become quiet again. A symbolic object established early, most likely the untouched cold coffee cup, the Swiss watch, or the marked contract, will return transformed. Claire may be gone already. Jonathan may notice she has straightened a misaligned document, left one handwritten line beneath a signature, or silently replaced his stopwatch battery beside the bill. His response will be minimal. Perhaps he reaches to stop an assistant from clearing her cup, or for the first time rises when a waitress approaches. The emotional turn comes through behavior, not declaration. Action first, feeling after. The audience reads change through what he now does, without knowing he is changed. The last beat should feel almost too quiet after the tension before it. A pause. A look held half a second longer. Fingers resting on porcelain after she has left. A room once ruled by his voice now held by silence. Parts 1 through 8 therefore must plant recurring symbols, establish his blindness to invisible dignity, let Claire never seek recognition, and ensure the climax is not the contract saved, but the inward shift made possible by it. The final moral line will arrive like an echo, not a lesson, soft enough to feel discovered rather than spoken. Something in the register of, some voices are only heard after they leave the room. Mr. Hayes. He did not ask for a lower price. He asked whether you understand honor. The words were barely above a whisper, yet they seemed to stop the air itself. 10 seconds earlier, the private negotiation suite on the 42nd floor of Hayes Global had been running with the cold precision Jonathan Hayes demanded from every room he entered. Crystal water glasses untouched. Leather folders aligned to the inch. A Swiss watch, ticking softly against Jonathan's wrist as $3 billion hovered over a single contract clause. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan glowed in winter rain. Inside, the deal was collapsing. Jonathan leaned forward, jaw tight, while his interpreter struggled through a rare Gulf dialect he clearly did not command. The Arab delegation exchanged glances. A phrase was mistranslated. Then another. Jonathan felt it before he understood it, the shift. Respect cooling into offense. Opportunity becoming insult. His pulse rose, though nothing in his face betrayed it. Men who built empires did not panic in public. Yet his hand had drifted unconsciously to the edge of the contract. A habit when danger moved unseen. Repeat what he said, Jonathan ordered. The interpreter swallowed, hesitated. Sweat gathered at his temple. Across the polished walnut table, Sheikh Rahman al-Nouri slowly closed his pen. It was a small movement, but in rooms like this, wars had started over smaller ones. Near the back wall, unnoticed by everyone but the old security camera in the corner, Claire Whitmore set down a silver coffee tray. She had been silent all evening, moving between executives like part of the furniture, refilling cups, clearing plates, eyes lowered. 26. Blonde hair pinned back. White shirt sleeves rolled once at the wrists. The kind of woman powerful men rarely remembered seeing. Yet when the sheik spoke again, something made her pause. One hand remained on the coffee pot. Her knuckles tightened almost imperceptibly. Jonathan did not notice her. He noticed only disaster. Translate, he snapped. The interpreter opened his mouth and said nothing. Silence spread. Heavy. Humiliating. Then came Claire's voice. Soft. Controlled. Sir, he isn't rejecting the offer. Every head turned. Jonathan blinked, as if the room had spoken from the walls. A waitress. His waitress. The interpreter looked offended. The sheik looked curious. Claire stepped no closer, did not apologize for speaking. He asked whether you would honor the partnership after profit fades. It was a test. Jonathan stared. Her accent was clean East Coast, but the Arabic phrase she repeated carried a cadence so precise even the sheik's expression shifted. Surprise first. Then something harder to earn. Recognition. The interpreter flushed crimson. Jonathan's instincts screamed not to trust this interruption. Yet something in her stillness unsettled him. She looked less like someone improvising and more like someone remembering. Rain tapped the windows. The watch on Jonathan's wrist ticked once.
Twice.
Claire lifted the coffee pot and added, almost as if discussing cream, "If you answer only with numbers, you lose him." No one moved. In 43 years, Jonathan Hayes had watched senators bluff, bankers crumble, rivals lie without blinking. But he had never seen a room turn on a whisper. He looked at the waitress as if seeing a hidden door appear in a familiar wall. And for the first time that night, he slid the contract closed.
Slowly.
As though listening for something beyond the deal. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan. Inside, the quiet woman by the coffee service had just altered the gravity of the room. And Jonathan Hayes had not yet realized the most dangerous thing in the room was no longer the failed translation, but the possibility he had been blind all along. Jonathan did not answer the sheik immediately. He looked instead at Claire, as if measuring whether the impossible had just happened or whether exhaustion had made him reckless. She did not hold his gaze. She simply lowered her eyes to the coffee service and waited, almost as if what she had done meant nothing at all. But across the table, Sheikh Rahman leaned back, fingers steepled, studying Jonathan with renewed interest. The failed interpreter shifted in his seat, wounded pride clouding his face. Then Jonathan spoke, slowly, not from the contract in front of him, but from instinct sharpened by the stranger who had interrupted his certainty. "A partnership survives," he said, choosing each word, "only when both men value honor more than leverage." Claire did not move, but something softened at the edge of her expression. The sheik's silver pen opened again with a quiet click. A smile, almost invisible, touched his face. The test had not been about money at all. Jonathan understood that now. For the next 20 minutes, the room changed shape. Claire did not sit at the table, yet somehow she became part of its gravity. When an idiom surfaced no one else understood, her voice arrived before confusion could grow. When a phrase carried more poetry than literal meaning, she adjusted the tone, not just the words. She did not translate like an employee. She interpreted like someone who understood the soul behind language. Jonathan found himself watching her when he should have been watching the numbers. The old certainty that he controlled every variable had begun to crack. At one point the sheik said something that made his advisors murmur in surprise. Claire paused before translating. "He says trust is not signed. It is remembered." Jonathan looked at her sharply. "And is that exact?" he asked. Claire met his eyes for the first time. "It is what he meant." The room went still again. Strange, Jonathan thought, how the quietest person in the room kept deciding its direction. During a brief recess, while the delegation stepped out for tea, Jonathan remained by the windows, staring at rain moving down the glass in silver threads. His general counsel approached in a whisper. "Who is she?" Jonathan did not answer, because he did not know. That unsettled him more than the deal had. Claire was collecting empty cups when Jonathan crossed the room toward her. Executives noticed. Assistants pretended not to stare. He stopped beside the tray. Up close he noticed things he had missed before. Ink on her fingertips. A worn leather notebook tucked into her apron pocket. A tiny scar near one wrist. Details too specific for someone meant to remain invisible. "Where did you learn Gulf Arabic?" he asked. She set down a porcelain cup before answering. "From my father." "You wait tables with a skill that could bill $500 an hour?" A faint smile touched her mouth. "Sometimes life renegotiates your plans." Before he could press further, she reached toward the contract packet left open on the sideboard. "Mr. Hayes." She pointed to a clause halfway down page 14. "That indemnity wording, if left as written, shifts future port liabilities to your side." Jonathan froze. His legal team had missed it. He took the document, reread the line, then looked at her as if a second hidden door had opened. "How did you see that?" Claire lifted the coffee tray again. "I was pouring Colombian roast beside it for 40 minutes. Then she walked back toward the service station, leaving Jonathan holding $1 billion contract he no longer trusted more than the waitress who had corrected it. And for the first time in years, the man who had built an empire felt something rarer than control. He felt curiosity. When the delegation returned, the air in the room had changed in a way no spreadsheet could measure. The contract still lay open beneath the brass conference lamp, but now Jonathan no longer saw it as a trophy to seize. It had become a field of hidden meanings, and somehow the woman carrying coffee had become the only person who seemed able to read its weather. Sheikh Rahman resumed his seat without hurry, his expression almost amused, as if he had watched something rare unfold and chosen not to interrupt it. The attorneys leaned in, pens uncapped, leather folders opened. But Jonathan's attention kept drifting to Claire, now back near the sideboard, writing something in the worn notebook from her apron. He should have returned to numbers. Instead, he wondered what else she had not said. Then, the second test came. It arrived disguised as casual conversation. The sheikh spoke in a softer dialect than before, older, layered with proverb. Even the interpreter did not attempt it. Claire listened, and for the first time a trace of hesitation touched her face. Jonathan saw it. A pulse of tension moved through him. Then she translated. He asks whether a man protects a bridge after crossing it, or only while he still needs to pass. One of the advisors frowned. What does that have to do with logistics? Jonathan did not answer. He had begun hearing meanings beneath words. He looked to Claire. She met his glance once, barely, as if telling him this answer mattered. Jonathan leaned forward. A bridge worth keeping, he said, is maintained even when the river runs dry. Silence. Then the sheikh laughed. Deep and warm. The kind of laugh that dissolved hierarchy. Even his advisors smiled. Claire lowered her eyes again, but Jonathan caught the smallest exhale leave her shoulders. Relief. She had been testing him too. The deal moved toward signature. But as final pages were exchanged, the sheikh stopped again and tapped one paragraph with a silver pen. He spoke a single sentence in Arabic. This time Claire did not translate immediately. Her fingers tightened around the coffee tray. Something in the phrase had struck deeper. Jonathan noticed. What did he say? He asked quietly. Claire answered almost reluctantly. He asked whether you know who first saved your company from the Port Said arbitration 7 years ago. Jonathan stared. The room blurred for a second. That arbitration had nearly destroyed Hayes Global before a mysterious independent translator had uncovered a hidden clause in Arabic maritime law. No one inside the company ever learned who it was. The consultant had refused publicity and disappeared after sending corrections through a third party. Jonathan had once called that unknown person the ghost who saved his empire. His voice dropped. Why would he ask that? Claire did not answer. Instead, she opened her notebook and slid a folded sheet across the polished table. Jonathan unfolded it. A photocopied margin note. Arabic annotations in blue ink. The same note he had kept locked in his office safe for 7 years. His throat tightened. This was yours. Not a question. Claire said nothing for a long moment. Rain whispered against the windows. Finally, she only nodded. Jonathan looked at the waitress, as though the room had tilted. This quiet woman had stood invisible at the edge of his world, while having once altered its course entirely. And he had never known her name. Before he could speak, the sheikh rose unexpectedly. Not to leave. To extend his hand. Now, Claire translated softly, he says he trusts a man who can recognize value after overlooking it. Jonathan stood. Their handshake sealed more than a contract. Yet his eyes remained on Claire. The signatures came minutes later, ink drying beneath soft lamplight. Applause never came. No one dared break the strange stillness settling over the room. Jonathan reached for his Swiss watch out of habit, then stopped. For the first time in years, he had forgotten to check the time. Because something far rarer than profit had entered the room, and it had spoken in a voice no one had thought to hear. The sheikh's delegation departed just after midnight, their elevator doors closing with a soft chime that seemed too ordinary for what had happened. The conference suite emptied in waves. Attorneys gathered papers. Assistants whispered into phones. Someone finally removed the untouched dessert plates. Yet Jonathan remained by the long walnut table, fingertips resting on the signed contract, as if still testing whether the night had been real. Across the room, Claire quietly stacked coffee cups onto the silver tray. The same woman who had entered the evening nearly invisible now moved through the aftermath, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. That unsettled him most. Great talent usually carried some hunger to be seen. Hers seemed almost committed to disappearance. Miss Whitmore. The sound of her name in Jonathan's voice made two junior associates glance up in surprise. He almost never used names below the executive floor. Claire turned. Yes, Mr. Hayes? He looked at the leather notebook in her hand. Walk with me. It was not an order, more an unfamiliar request. She hesitated only a second, then followed him out into the private corridor overlooking Midtown. Rain had stopped. The city below shimmered in wet gold. For a while neither spoke. Their reflections moved beside them in the dark glass. Jonathan loosened his tie, a gesture no one at Hayes Global had likely witnessed in public. Why did you never come forward after Port Said? Claire rested one hand, lightly, on the window rail. Because I was paid to solve a problem, not to be remembered for it. Jonathan gave a faint disbelieving laugh. Most people would have put it on every resume they owned. Most people, she said softly, have not watched credit become a contest. Her answer carried old weight. Jonathan studied her profile. There was history there he did not yet understand. You were not meant to be carrying coffee trays. Claire smiled, but it held no bitterness. Neither were you born expecting to need saving from a waitress. For the first time in years, Jonathan laughed without calculation. Quietly, almost boyishly. It startled even him. Then his expression shifted. Come work for me. The offer came too quickly, instinct before thought. Name the number. Advisory role. International strategy. Anything. Claire looked down at the city lights before answering. You still think recognition begins with a title? Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it. Because she was right. She reached into her notebook and removed a folded page covered in handwritten Arabic phrases. My father used to make me translate proverbs at breakfast. He said language reveals character before contracts do. Jonathan took the sheet like something fragile. At the bottom, one line was underlined in blue ink. He asked her what it meant. Claire translated without looking at it. The loudest man in the room is often the one most afraid of silence. Jonathan stared at the words. A truth sharp enough to wound because it fit too well. Before he could respond, his chief of staff hurried from the conference suite. Sir, the Gulf team has one final request before they leave for the airport. Jonathan turned, then paused. For years he would have walked off without another thought. Instead he looked back at Claire. Wait here. She gave the smallest amused shake of her head. I have a breakfast shift at 6:30. Yet she stayed. 20 minutes later Jonathan returned to find her not by the windows, but seated alone at the conference table correcting a line of Arabic calligraphy on the ceremonial gift the sheik had left behind. He watched without announcing himself. Her concentration was almost reverent. No performance. No audience. Just care. In that moment Jonathan felt something inside him reorder itself, though he could not yet name it. He stepped closer. Claire looked up. You fixed his inscription. One word was off, she said. It changed respect into obedience. Jonathan looked at her a long time, then at the corrected script. A single word changed the meaning of everything. Somehow it felt larger than language. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the empty tower, the man who had spent a lifetime mastering power began, almost imperceptibly, to learn humility. Claire should have left after that night. By every rhythm of ordinary life, she should have disappeared back into the anonymity from which she had stepped. But 3 mornings later Jonathan Hayes found himself standing in a quiet neighborhood cafe 12 blocks from the financial district, long before his driver expected him anywhere.
No marble lobby.
No executive boardroom. Just old oak floors, warm light, and the smell of dark roast rising through winter air. He had come because a name in payroll records had led him there. Claire Whitmore worked breakfast shifts at a place called Marlowe House. Somehow that fact troubled him. It seemed impossible that someone who had saved billion-dollar negotiations spent dawn carrying ceramic mugs to commuters. Yet there she was behind the counter, sleeves rolled, writing specials on a chalkboard in careful script. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. Surprise crossed her face, then something harder to read. "You are far from your tower, Mr. Hayes." Jonathan almost smiled. "And you are still calling me Mr. Hayes after saving my reputation." She poured coffee without asking and slid the cup toward him. "Black."
No sugar.
He looked up. "How did you know?" Claire wiped the counter with a folded cloth. Men who control everything rarely trust sweetness they did not add themselves. He laughed again, and a retired couple near the window turned at the sound, as if wealthy men were not expected to laugh in diners. Jonathan noticed something then. Claire was not merely serving tables. She was remembered by everyone who entered. A mailman greeted her by first name. An old woman asked her to read a prescription label. A construction worker left exact change, and a thank you written on a napkin. She moved among ordinary lives with the same calm precision she had moved through billion-dollar negotiations. No performance, just quiet usefulness. It unsettled Jonathan more deeply than the conference room ever had. "Why here?" he asked after a while. "With what you know, why choose this?" Claire leaned against the counter, considering whether to answer. "My father taught languages at a public school in Queens. After he passed, I finished what debts he left. This place gave me hours flexible enough to care for my mother before she died." She glanced toward the kitchen. Then life kept moving. Jonathan looked at the coffee in his hand. For years he had treated biography as leverage, every story useful only if it explained behavior. Hers did something stranger. It made him feel small. At noon he finally said, "I meant what I said. Come to advise Hayes Global." Claire shook her head. "And sit in rooms where people only listen after discovering a waitress's value?" She set a plate beside him. Toast he had not ordered. Respect should begin sooner than that. Her words landed gently, which made them sharper. Before Jonathan could respond, the cafe owner emerged carrying an envelope. "Claire, your landlord came by." Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. A flicker. She slipped the envelope into her apron unread. Jonathan noticed. Hours later, back in his office, he could not focus on quarterly projections. He kept seeing the envelope disappear into her apron pocket. At sunset, he asked his assistant for Claire's employee file again. Not to investigate, to understand. Instead, he found an old note attached to her original catering contract. Temporary hire approved. Applicant declined management track twice. Reason given. Prefers to remain where she can hear people speak honestly. Jonathan read that line twice. Then a thought arrived with unsettling force. Had Claire been choosing obscurity or guarding something? The next morning he returned to Marlowe House before sunrise. The cafe was closed. Lights off. But taped to the door was a handwritten note in Claire's neat script. "Closed today. Family matter." Jonathan stood there in cold morning wind, reading 4 simple words that somehow carried absence louder than any speech. And for the first time in years, a man accustomed to summoning answers with one phone call found himself waiting. Jonathan returned the next morning. And the morning after that. On the third day the handwritten note was gone, the lights inside Marlowe House glowing amber through the window before dawn. He entered to the sound of chairs being set down and old jazz humming low from a radio in the kitchen. Claire stood alone at a corner table sorting papers into neat stacks. Not menus. Documents. Utility notices. Medical invoices. Her head lifted when the bell above the door rang, and for the first time Jonathan saw genuine surprise without her usual composure quick enough to hide it. "You came back." "You were gone," he said simply. Neither seemed to realize how much had been said in those 4 words. She folded the papers closed. "My father's brother passed in New Jersey. There were things to settle." Jonathan nodded, though his eyes had caught the overdue notices before she covered them. He did not mention them. Something in him had begun learning restraint. Claire poured coffee and they sat, not across a counter now, but at the same worn oak table near the fogged front window where morning regulars had not yet arrived. Outside, delivery trucks rolled through slush. Inside, the world felt paused. Jonathan looked at the leather notebook beside her cup. "There is more you are not telling me." Claire traced the rim of her mug with one finger. "There is always more." Then, after a silence, she opened the notebook and slid it toward him. It was filled not with personal reflections but handwritten translations, legal annotations, old diplomatic phrases, pages worn soft from use. Near the back was a letter of admission from Geneva Institute of International Mediation. Full fellowship. Jonathan looked up. "You were trained for this." "I was accepted," she corrected softly. "I never went." "Because of family?" She nodded. "My father became ill that summer. Choices became simple after that." Jonathan read the date again. 21 years old. A life rerouted by duty. He thought of every ambitious person he had promoted for sacrificing less. Something heavy stirred behind his ribs. "You gave up a career most people would chase forever." Claire smiled faintly. "I learned languages anyway, just in smaller rooms." Their coffee cooled. Unnoticed. Then Jonathan said something he had not planned to say. "I spent half my life believing worth announces itself." Claire looked at him, waiting. "You are teaching me it often does not." Before she could answer, a black sedan pulled abruptly to the curb outside. Jonathan recognized the crest on the door before the driver stepped out. Gulf delegation.
Impossible.
Moments later, Sheikh Rahman himself entered the cafe, snow on his overcoat, drawing startled looks from two early customers. Claire stood in disbelief. Jonathan rose. The Sheikh embraced him lightly, then turned to Claire with unmistakable warmth. Through accented English, he said, "I was told the wisest negotiator in New York serves breakfast." Claire laughed despite herself. The Sheikh placed a narrow cedar box on the table. Inside lay an antique fountain pen and a folded invitation. A mediation summit in Geneva. Private appointment requested for Claire Whitmore. Jonathan looked from the invitation to Claire, stunned. The path she once lost had somehow circled back. Yet Claire did not reach for the paper. Her eyes had gone still. "I cannot leave," she said almost to herself. Jonathan knew instantly why. The unpaid notices. Obligations. Invisible anchors. The Sheikh sensed it too, but said nothing. He only bowed his head and left the invitation on the table. After he departed, silence lingered. Claire stared at the unopened envelope as if it belonged to another life. Jonathan spoke carefully. "If debt is what holds you here." She stopped him with one look. Not offended. Firm. "Do not solve me with money." He nodded. Lesson received. But as she rose to refill a customer's cup, Jonathan noticed the landlord envelope half visible beneath her notebook, stamped final notice. A small thing. Easily missed. Yet something inside him aligned with quiet certainty. Not the old instinct to rescue. Something gentler. To honor. When Claire returned, the invitation was still untouched. Jonathan slid the fountain pen toward her. "At least hold the instrument before refusing the music." She looked at him for a long moment, then took the pen. Its weight settled into her hand as naturally as if it had been waiting there for years. And in the cafe window, reflected beside winter streetlights, Jonathan saw not a waitress and a billionaire, but two lives standing at the edge of a door neither had expected to reopen. Claire did not mention the Geneva invitation for 3 days. Yet Jonathan felt its presence in every silence between them, like a note still vibrating after the music stops. He came to Marlowe House each morning before the rush, no longer pretending he was there by accident. Sometimes they spoke about contracts translated through poetry. Sometimes about her father teaching idioms over burnt toast. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all. Yet something unspoken kept deepening. Then, on the 4th morning, Claire was absent again. In her place, the owner, old Mr. Marlowe, poured Jonathan coffee and slid a folded envelope across the counter. "She asked me to give you this if you came." Jonathan opened it. One line in Claire's careful hand. "If you still think language reveals character, come to Hayes Tower at noon." He looked up sharply. At 11:58, he stepped into the executive conference floor and found the largest boardroom full. Senior partners, international counsel, even Sheikh Rahman had returned by private flight. At the far end of the room stood Claire, not in an apron but in a charcoal suit he had never seen, hair pinned differently, posture altered only by confidence, no longer disguised. For a breath, Jonathan forgot to move. She looked less transformed than revealed. "What is this?" he asked. Claire answered with a small smile. "Your second test." On the central screen glowed a draft memorandum for the Geneva summit. But one paragraph, buried deep, carried a linguistic ambiguity that could shift sovereign arbitration authority. Deliberate. A trap hidden in prestige. The room buzzed with disagreement. Two attorneys argued opposite interpretations. The sheik watched in silence. Jonathan realized what this was. Not merely negotiation. A final proving ground. Claire spoke. There is an Ottoman-era phrase in the original French commentary no one has accounted for. She looked at Jonathan. "Would you like to try?" He almost laughed at the audacity. Yet he stepped forward. Days ago, he would have deferred to experts. Now he studied the text, remembering proverbs, bridges, silences, meanings behind words. Then he answered slowly. The phrase does not assign control. It imposes stewardship. Claire held his gaze. Something almost proud flickered there. But one advisor objected, pressing a rival interpretation. Tension sharpened. Then Sheikh Rahman rose. In Arabic, he spoke a proverb none of the attorneys understood. The room turned to Claire. But she did not answer. She looked to Jonathan. A challenge. Trusting him to hear beyond translation. He thought of the blue ink line in her notebook. The loudest man is often most afraid of silence. He let the room go still, then said, "He is asking whether wisdom serves power or power serves wisdom." The sheik smiled broadly. "Now," he said in English, "you hear?" A ripple of stunned laughter moved through the room. The ambiguity was resolved. The memorandum approved. Yet the true climax had happened elsewhere. Jonathan turned toward Claire as partners began congratulating one another. "You arranged this." "No," she said softly. "You grew into it." He noticed then the landlord envelope was gone from her notebook. In its place lay the Geneva invitation, signed. His chest tightened unexpectedly. "You accepted." Claire nodded. "This morning." For a moment the room blurred around them. He wanted to say something grand, something equal to what she had changed. Instead, he only noticed a button loose on her cuff and, without thinking, reached to fasten it. The gesture was so small neither seemed prepared for its intimacy. Claire looked down, then back up with a quietness almost brighter than joy. Around them the boardroom continued in polished noise, but a different silence held between them. Then Jonathan did something no one at Hayes Global had seen him do. As the partners prepared formal introductions for Geneva, he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and stepped aside. Not for a guest. For Claire. Some executive stared. The sheik lowered his head in approval. Claire hesitated, then took the seat Jonathan had never yielded. No speech followed. None was needed, because in a room once ruled by hierarchy, one simple movement had already said what power rarely knows how to say. Snow fell the morning Claire left for Geneva. Fine, quiet snow, the kind that softened even Manhattan's sharp edges. Jonathan stood at the private terminal before sunrise, hands in his coat pockets, watching crews move luggage through blue dawn light. For a man who had closed mergers worth billions without a tremor, he felt strangely unsteady beside a departure gate. Claire arrived carrying one leather satchel and the old notebook worn at the corners.
No entouraje.
No drama. Just the same quiet composure she had carried into the conference room that first night with a coffee tray in her hands. "You brought only one bag?" Jonathan asked. Claire glanced at the jet beyond the glass. "Language travels light." He smiled. There had been a time he would have answered with strategy. Now, he simply stood beside her in companionable silence. The Geneva summit lasted 6 weeks. News reached New York in fragments. A deadlocked mediation reopened. A shipping dispute resolved after 12 years. European papers quoted an unnamed American mediator whose phrasing ended a diplomatic impasse over water rights. Jonathan read every line and said nothing to anyone. But each morning his assistant found him earlier at the office, one cup of black coffee beside the window, another untouched across from him. When Claire returned, spring had begun. Trees in Bryant Park showed first green. Yet she did not go first to Hayes Tower. She went to Marlowe House. Jonathan found her there that evening, wiping down the same oak counter as though Geneva had been a brief errand. "You negotiated with ministers," he said, "and still came back for breakfast shifts." Claire folded a towel. "Some rooms applaud too quickly." He looked at her a long moment. "You changed international policy." "And old Mrs. Donnelly still likes her tea too weak," she said, nodding toward the elderly woman in the corner booth. Jonathan laughed softly. But that night something waited unfinished between them. After closing, Claire walked with him through the city. They passed storefront lights reflected in rain-slick pavement, saying little. Near Hayes Tower she stopped. "There is something I never answered." Jonathan turned. "Why I stayed invisible." She reached into her notebook and handed him a single page. It was the original catering application she had submitted years ago. In the margin, in blue ink, one sentence he had never seen. "Sometimes the quietest seat in the room hears the truth first." Jonathan looked up slowly. "You chose that life." "For a while," she said, until a frightened chief executive panicked over a failed interpreter. The teasing in her voice was light, but Jonathan heard the deeper current beneath it. He folded the paper and slipped it into his coat, as if storing something fragile. The next morning, Hayes Global hosted a formal reception honoring the Gulf Agreement and Geneva Accords. Hundreds attended. Crystal chandeliers. Cameras. Speeches prepared. Jonathan stepped to the podium while Claire stood near the back, almost hidden again among staff. Everyone expected a triumphal address. Instead, Jonathan looked across the ballroom and said only, "Tonight I owe thanks to someone who corrected more than a translation." Murmurs stirred. He paused. Then, to the astonishment of directors and diplomats alike, he stepped away from the microphone before finishing the prepared speech. He crossed the ballroom, passing investors, senators, applause half rising then faltering in confusion. He stopped beside a junior server carrying a silver coffee tray, a nervous young woman no one important had noticed all evening. Jonathan quietly took the tray from her hands and set it on a nearby table so she could rest her trembling wrists. Then he nodded once and returned to the podium. The room had gone still. Claire had not moved, but something in her eyes changed. A recognition too subtle for anyone else to name. Jonathan did not explain the gesture. He simply resumed, signed one ceremonial document, and after the event ended, most guests drifted out into the city. Much later, as staff cleared glasses, Claire passed the head table and noticed Jonathan's Swiss watch resting beside an untouched cold coffee cup. She straightened the cup, so its handle faced outward, exactly as she had done months ago on the night they met. Jonathan watched her do it and said nothing. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. Because some changes arrive not when a man speaks more wisely, but when he begins noticing the hands that pour the coffee. The ballroom emptied long before Jonathan left. Staff folded linen. Chandeliers dimmed one bank at a time. Somewhere far below, the city kept moving, yellow cabs threading through midnight rain. Yet on the executive floor, one lamp still burned above the conference table, where months earlier a frightened interpreter had faltered and a quiet waitress had changed the shape of a room. Jonathan stood alone there now, jacket off, sleeves rolled, studying the signed Geneva Accords laid neatly beside the old Swiss watch. The untouched coffee cup remained where Claire had turned its handle outward. Such a small correction. Yet he had not moved it. The cleaning crew had passed twice. Still it remained. At last he heard the soft click of the service door. Claire entered carrying no tray tonight, only her notebook tucked beneath one arm. She paused when she saw the room still lit. "You are here late." Jonathan glanced at the documents. "I was trying to understand when this room changed." Claire stepped closer, but did not answer. Instead, she noticed one page slightly misaligned in the stack and, almost absently, squared its corners with her fingertips. The same unconscious precision he had come to recognize as its own language. Jonathan watched her hand. Then, without thinking, he slid the chair at the head of the table back from its place and moved it beside the others. Not dramatically. Barely a sound. Just no longer separate. Claire looked at the shifted chair, then at him. Neither spoke. Rain whispered against the glass. In the silence, Jonathan removed his Swiss watch and set it beside the cold coffee cup. For years he had wound it every night before leaving. Tonight, he did not. Claire opened her notebook, tore out a small sheet, wrote one line, and placed it beneath the cup. She closed the notebook and turned to go. Jonathan did not stop her. Only after she reached the door did he unfold the paper.
In
blue ink were 6 words. You listened before asking who I was. He looked up, but Claire had not left. She stood by the doorway waiting, not for reply, perhaps only for the room to settle around what had been said without speech. Jonathan crossed to the service cart near the wall, where one cup remained unwashed. He rinsed it himself at the small sink, dried it with a linen cloth, and set it carefully back on the silver tray exactly where a server would place it. When he turned, Claire was watching him with an expression almost too quiet to read. He walked to the door and held it open for her. Not as gesture, as instinct. They stepped into the dark corridor together. At the elevator, Claire pressed the call button, then glanced at his wrist. You forgot your watch. Jonathan looked back through the glass wall at the table where it lay beside the cup. No, he said softly. I left it. The elevator arrived. Doors opened. They entered without touching. As the doors began to close, a young overnight porter hurried down the hall carrying a stack of files too high to balance. Papers slipped. Jonathan moved before thought, catching the top folders, helping him steady the stack. The porter blinked, startled that the man whose name hung on the tower would stop for such a thing. Jonathan handed the files back with a nod and stepped into the elevator. Claire said nothing, but when the door sealed, her eyes held that same almost smile from the first night she corrected a translation and altered a destiny. 42 floors down, the elevator opened to the marble lobby. The night guard rose automatically, then paused in confusion as Jonathan crossed not toward the private exit, but toward the coffee station near reception. One paper cup sat crooked beside the urn. Jonathan straightened it before leaving. Just that. Outside, rain had stopped. Sidewalks shone silver. Claire turned toward the subway entrance. Jonathan toward the waiting car. For a moment they stood beneath the same street lamp, neither reaching for farewell. Then Claire gave the smallest nod and disappeared down the station steps. Jonathan remained there after she was gone, listening to the hush after trains pass. Underground, behind him in the tower, his watch lay unwound beside a cold cup of coffee. And in the quiet that followed, it seemed possible that dignity does not arrive when power learns to speak softer, but when it finally learns to notice what was quietly serving it all along.